Hi, I'm George Salinas, and today I'd like to talk about a subject that I think is quite important for all of us. This is based on a series that I call What's That All About? The subject is success versus failure. So, what we want to do is we want to look at success and failure in terms of both opportunities versus challenges. When we think of our work and endeavors, it's great to think about our successes. However, we should consider how failures have played out in the long term. Let's look at some of the dynamics between success and failure. According to the dictionary, success is the favorable or prosperous result of attempts or endeavors, the accomplishment of one's goals, the attainment of wealth, position, honors, or the like. It also may be a performance or achievement marked by success as by attainment of such honors. On the other hand, failure is an act or instance of failing or proving unsuccessful, lack of success. Two, it is poor performance of something due, required, or expected. Or three, it could be a subnormal quantity or quality, an insufficiency. So when we look at those definitions, is that accurate? Both success and failure may be framed by what we determine is important. Each experience we have brings its own opportunities and challenges. If success comes easily, does it also perhaps create pitfalls? When, not if we fail, will that damage our behavior or mindset? Is failure just a disappointment in one's experience? Do we sometimes choose not to compete simply because we're afraid of failing? Even with success, if it's just a scorecard, then focus, dedication, or even financial gain may not seem enough. So, a side by side comparison between success versus failure is a helpful way to better understand the impact of both scenarios. So, let's compare both the opportunities and challenges of success and failure. So let's get things started with a quote. What do you think about this? The quote says, I've never learned anything from success. What do you think? Is that contrary to our understanding of what it means to be successful? Or does it tell us something that is perhaps even deeper in our understanding? Well, that quote came from Ed Sheeran, the songwriter, the singer, really famous guy in terms of when asked a question on a talk show, he asked, he was asked, what do you think? What is the key to your success? And that's what his answer was. So let's look at other points of view that have to pertain to what success is and what its relationship is to failure. So with that, we'll get ready and we'll go to our next slide. Thanks. This is a slide that talks about discovery or burnout. Of course, you'll see in this diagram that there are opportunities to think about what we can discover when we go through conditions of failure, or what do we in fact discover if we go through conditions of success, perhaps premature success. But what does it take to get to that point? Well, let's take a look at this particular quote coming up as follows. Here's what the quote said. It said, failure will never stand in the way of success if you've learned from it. So, who said that? Well, a Hall of Famer, for Major League Baseball said it. That Hall of League famer was Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron made that statement. So the question is, what do we have the opportunity and what are the challenges about both success and failure? Well, first of all, when we talk about failure, it's an opportunity for us to look at it as it's an opportunity for experience, gaining experience in terms of what we have. It's also an opportunity to look at reflection in terms of what we have as far as our experience with failure and success. But in addition, we can look at outcome. What are the outcomes that can come and arise out of our experiences, whether they are successful experiences or, as we say, failures? And then, of course, one of the last things we want to think about is how can we grow? What can we do? What kind of growth can we get that can come from these experiences? So let's go ahead and take a look at our next slide. In this particular case, the quote that I'm about to show you might be a little bit of a surprise. So here's the quote. The quote says, "There is no such thing as failure. Failure is life trying to move us in another direction." So who was the one that quoted this? Well, it was Oprah Winfrey, media mogul and philanthropist. So you see, sometimes we find ourselves, okay, here we are. We are pursuing something, and then all of a sudden, we get a dead end. We've been taking winding roads, and we maybe get to the point and we say, well, wait a minute, I don't understand where this is taking me. It can be confusing. But the point is, when we do take the new road, it might lead us to a completely new path, and we might actually discover a new purpose of what we need to be doing. So it's very interesting to take a look at what failure may bring in relationship to success. Now let's go ahead and take a look at another slide, if we can. Let's take a look at another scenario when we're talking about success versus failure. In this particular slide, we're going to take a look at new strategies versus perhaps overconfidence. Well, of course, the challenge we have sometimes is if we do have success, we don't want to overreact to the point that we feel we don't need any more input, that we know exactly what to do. That, of course, can be a dangerous situation to be in. On the other hand, if we find ourselves, like in this image here, if we find ourselves in a maze, the question becomes, how do we get out of the maze? Where is the exit, right? Is there a way we can find our way out of the maze? Are we feeling boxed in terms of the solution? We need to solve what's going on in terms of where we need to be. But at the same time, we need to, even if we do have success, we don't want to let it go to our head. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a guy that revolutionized today's common vacuum. He made a quote. This is what the gentleman said. He said, I made 5,127 prototypes of my vacuum before I got it right. There were 5,126 failures. But I learned from each one. I don't mind failures. Well, the successful person that made that quote was James Dyson, inventor of the bagless vacuum. So here again is looking at what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, whether we have success or whether we have failure. Here we're going to hear about a quote that perhaps you've heard about. And the short term is, I didn't see it coming. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. It freed me to enter into one of the most creative periods of my life. That was a quote from Steve Jobs, founder of Apple Computer. So, what do we learn about when we do fail? Is it an opportunity, for example, for us to rethink? Do we find new ways to look at what we're doing and bring new innovation? Also, we can think about it this way. If we have a pot, here's our pot. We have a pot, and in the pot, we got a new plant. So here's the plant. We have a new pot with the plant. Does the plant sprout because of old ways of thinking? Or does the plant sprout because we have new ways of thinking? This is the opportunity we have. Whereas if, for example, success comes too quickly, then we may get into the trap of being complacent with where we are and not coming up with new ways to think. We may sit on our laurels and find out later that we don't have any thoughts about how to go forward. So that's an opportunity to think about the opportunities of new innovation versus becoming complacent if we, in fact, experience success too soon. We're going to take a look at a slide titled Accept Risk versus Fear of Failure. The real question becomes, is failure a risk? Or is success a risk? Well, here's a quote that we want to take a look at. The quote talks about a gentleman who applied for 30 jobs. He got rejected. He said, when I applied for 30 jobs, I got rejected. When KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, came along, 23 people were accepted. I was the only guy who got rejected. So who was the successful person that made that quote? Well, that's Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, e-business entrepreneur. So let's just think about a couple of things. First of all, let's think about the fact that life equals risk. In other words, do we know what's going to happen tomorrow? Do we know what's going to happen in an hour? No, we really don't. At the same time, we can say that risk equals change. So here you go. You got life and risk. You got risk and change. Life is change. The fact is, even with success, success adds pressure to what we do. So the point is, what do we do about that? Well, the fact is, Even failure gives us the opportunity to try again, to be able to realize that just because we didn't make the cut on the first try, like Jack Ma, that doesn't mean that's the end of the story. So, of course, the relationship here is when you look at the opportunities versus the challenges of both failure and risk, the fact is we just have to accept the fact that risk is something that we're willing to take when we even face new situations in terms of failure. Our slide now is being adaptable versus being unteachable. Very famous person made the following statement: I don't like to lose at anything. Yet I've grown most not from victories, but setbacks. If winning is God's reward, then losing is how he teaches us. So, who said the quote? Well, first of all, the quote was from Serena Williams, the tennis legend. And so here, if we take a look at this, we think about the fact is, as we said before, things change. We have to accept the fact that things are going to change. So in this particular case, we have to adjust. In other words, we got to be able to be bendable. Here we are trying to be bendable, okay? It's sometimes like taking our iron will and letting it bend a little bit. So, number one, we got to be adaptable and bendable. What we want to be able to avoid is, of course, the fact that we don't want to get involved in the trap. You know what the trap is? The trap is when we become overconfident and content with our success to the point where we can't listen to anyone. And so, in that sense, we can let success go to our heads. And we don't want to do that because then we become unteachable. And not only do we not learn anything new that we can use in our next opportunity and experience, but when people find out that we're unteachable, you know what they do? They run away from us. So we have to think about that opportunity that failure can give us in learning to become bendable and teachable. Okay, we have an opportunity now to look at another slide with the two topics about success and failure being resilient versus being isolated. So what it really comes down to, how do we respond when we have a particular situation? Well, what happens when you find yourself in prison for 27 years? Well, there was a very successful statesman that did that, said that do not judge me by my successes, but by how many times I got back up. So who was that? It was Nelson Mandela, the Nobel laureate and global statesman. So the question becomes, when we do have catastrophic situations, we're going to have a shaking. That shaking is going to affect us, obviously, in many ways. Well, the question is, let's say you got your plant here, right? We looked at a plant, we're growing a plant out of a pot. When you do run across shakings like this is the opportunity to reroute, to look at what can we do to take what we have and turn it into something new? Well, it's the opportunity to develop new roots. And in the case of Mandela, that's exactly what he did. And he realized, now, of course, I can't read Mandela's mind at the time, but he realized that he had some options. One option was do nothing, just kind of say, well, it happens. What can I do about it? Well, the fact is, what we can do is, as I show here in this particular illustration, what we can do is we can decide that the key is to take an action step, not do nothing, nor is it just to say, well, I give up, I'm not going to try, but to say, you know what, this is an opportunity for me to refocus and determine what is the key to turning the situation around. Well, of course, in his case, it was his vision that he didn't want to give up. And of course, it was the fact that he said, I got to manage this over time. I got to be patient. So this is an opportunity to think about success and failure in terms of, do we give up on something? Do we just get depressed and sulk? Or do we say it's time for action steps and do something about it? So let's talk about our next slide that has to do with character build versus compromise. Well, of course, in any scenario where we're trying to achieve success, the question is, what are we really going after? Are we going after the money? Are we going after a particular goal that in many cases is short term? Or are we trying to do it in a principled way? Well, obviously, in this example, there are choices that we have to make in terms of which path we're going to take. Well, in this particular case, here's a quote that is interesting. The quote says, I missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. 26 times I have been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeed. So who took that quote? Who made that quote? Well, it was none other than Michael Jordan, the NBA legend. So, when we think about what we're trying to achieve, the fact is this, we have to think about, are we going on principles? Are we trying to learn, even in the case of Michael Jordan, are we trying to learn from our failures? Or are we just compromising with the famous dollar sign? What are we really chasing? And chasing the dollar sign, is it really going to get us where we want it to be get? The fact is, the good news about taking the road of character build is that we go up one step at a time. And this, of course, is the important thing that we need to think about, is that in the long term, what is really to our advantage? Not that we can utilize today, but how it's going to serve us for tomorrow. So, when you really think about it, I think Michael Jordan had a pretty interesting perspective in terms of what was really important, in terms of what we should be setting our sights on. So on our last slide today, I want to read a quote that maybe you have heard. Here's how the quote goes. I have not failed. I have just found 10,000 ways that will not work. Interesting quote, isn't it? This quote was by Thomas Edison, the inventor and pioneer. So what can we conclude from what we've looked at in terms of what's involved with success and failure? Well, we've started all the way from looking at new discoveries to building character. We've looked at possible burnout to perhaps compromising our values for the sake of perhaps short-term gain. So what can we conclude from these very successful people who've shared their thoughts and comments to us? Well, for example, is failure a regrettable and painful experience, or is it a necessity for transformation over time? Is it the very opportunity that we need for learning and change? Shouldn't failure have its rightful place in our experience and our lives? Perhaps failure is indeed a requirement of success. So, with that, George Salinas signing off here. Onward and upward. Take care.